In October this year, something happened that could change the future of trade between China and Europe. The European Union officially passed a proposal to impose tariffs on electric vehicles made in China. On the surface, it looked like a simple economic decision, but in reality, it pushed China-EU relations to their coldest point in years. To understand why this is such a big deal, think of it like two business partners who've worked together for decades. One partner suddenly accuses the other of being too successful and slaps new rules to slow them down. That's what the EU just did to China. China's electric vehicle industry has been booming, fast, efficient, and affordable. But this success has made European car makers nervous. They see Chinese EVs filling their markets, taking customers, and threatening their dominance. So the EU decided to protect its car industry by imposing higher import taxes, also known as tariffs. But here's the twist. China didn't sit back quietly. Within weeks, Beijing launched countermeasures, freezing multi-billion euro investments in countries like Germany and Italy. This move sent a clear message. If Europe wants to play economic hardball, China knows how to respond. To understand Europe's sudden move against Chinese electric vehicles, we need to look at one simple fact. China's EV industry is growing too fast. In just a few years, Chinese automakers have gone from local players to global leaders. According to the latest statistics, 8 out of the top 10 best-selling electric vehicle brands in Europe are now from China. Even Tesla, which many people see as the king of EVs, is only ranked 4th in Europe. Last year, nearly 20% of all electric vehicles sold in Europe were made in China, and experts predict that by the end of this year, that number could jump to 25%. In other words, 1 out of every 4 EVs in Europe could soon be Chinese. This explosive success has left European automakers in panic mode. Brands like Volkswagen, Peugeot, Renault, and BMW have seen their sales drop sharply. Their electric models often cost more but offer less battery life and slower innovation compared to Chinese cars. Imagine running a race and realizing your rival, who started later, is suddenly miles ahead. That's how European car makers feel right now. So, the EU stepped in, claiming that China's EV companies receive unfair government subsidies, financial support that gives them an advantage. But beneath that claim lies something deeper: fear of losing control over the car market, which has been one of Europe's strongest industries for decades. By imposing tariffs, Europe hopes to buy time for its own companies to catch up. But in doing so, it risks starting a trade war that could hurt everyone involved. And here's where things get even more interesting, because while the EU was busy creating barriers, it was also secretly inviting Chinese car companies to build factories inside Europe. Here's where the story takes a strange turn. While the European Union was busy raising tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, some as high as 35%, individual European countries were inviting those same Chinese companies to build factories in Europe. It sounds contradictory, right? Like locking your doors, but handing the intruder a spare key. Let's break it down. In July 2024, the EU announced its anti-subsidy tax plan. BYD was hit with 17%, Geely with 18.8%, and SAIC with a massive 35.3% tariff. The official reason was to protect local industries from what they called unfair competition. But at the same time, countries like Spain, Italy, Germany, and France were hosting meetings with Chinese automakers, urging them to invest locally. The idea was simple. If Chinese companies built factories inside Europe, their cars wouldn't count as imports. That means no tariffs, more jobs, and smoother access to the European market. However, there was another motive behind these warm invitations: technology. Europe knows that Chinese electric vehicles have advanced battery systems, software, and manufacturing efficiency that Western brands struggle to match. By bringing Chinese companies onto European soil, policymakers hope to absorb that knowledge and close the innovation gap. But China saw through the plan. Many Chinese firms realized that setting up factories in Europe could expose them to technological snooping, stricter local regulations, and political risk. It's like being invited to dinner by someone who's really just curious about your recipe. So, while Europe was trying to play both sides, blocking imports but begging for investment, China quietly prepared for a countermove. And that moment came when negotiations between Beijing and Brussels completely broke down. Before taking any drastic steps, China tried diplomacy first. Beijing didn't immediately retaliate when the EU announced its tariff proposal. Instead, it spent months in talks and negotiations, hoping to ease tensions and find a balanced solution. Between July and October 2024, Chinese and European representatives met 9 times to discuss the issue. China made it clear it wanted fair treatment and open trade, not a confrontation. But despite those talks, the European Union remained firm. Finally, in October 2024, the EU held a decisive vote. Out of all the member states, 10 countries supported the new tariffs, 5 opposed, and 12 abstained. The outcome sealed the deal. Europe officially decided to impose tariffs of up to 35.3% on Chinese EVs. That vote was more than just a policy decision. It was a signal. It told Beijing that the EU was willing to prioritize its short-term protectionism over long-term cooperation. In simple terms, the message was, "We don't want to depend on your cars anymore." For China, this was the breaking point. After 9 rounds of fruitless dialogue, it became clear that the EU wasn't going to change course. So Beijing shifted from negotiation to action. The next phase wasn't about words, it was about results. And that's when China's counterattack began, hitting Europe exactly where it would feel the most pain, its investments in industries. China's response was swift and strategic. Just days after the EU finalized its decision to impose tariffs, Beijing struck back, not with words, but with money. One of China's top battery manufacturers, Honeycomb Energy, announced that it would suspend 2 major investment projects in Germany, worth a total of 3.87 billion euros. To understand how big this is, picture this. These weren't small pilot projects. They were cornerstone factories meant to power Europe's transition to electric mobility. The first factory, located in Saarland, was planned to produce battery modules and packs with a yearly capacity of 24 gigawatt-hours, enough to power over 500,000 electric cars. It represented 2 billion euros in investment and was scheduled for completion in mid-2024. The second one, in Lauchhammer, Brandenburg, was a 1.87 billion euro plant aimed at producing advanced battery cells, the heart of every EV. It was expected to begin production in 2025 and was celebrated as the first overseas battery cell factory by a Chinese energy company. Now, both projects are on hold. Honeycomb Energy made it clear that market conditions and policy uncertainties in Europe forced them to make this difficult but necessary choice. For Germany, this was a huge blow. Not only did it lose billions in direct investment, but it also lost thousands of future jobs and a chance to strengthen its EV supply chain. Worse still, Europe's own battery industry is already struggling. The European battery giant Northvolt recently announced layoffs of around 1,600 workers due to slow demand and high costs. By suspending these projects, China hit Germany right in its weak spot, manufacturing competitiveness. Without reliable battery suppliers, Europe's EV dream suddenly looks shaky. And Germany isn't alone. Another European nation, Italy, was also caught in the storm of China's countermeasures. While Germany took the first hit, Italy's story is even more ironic. A classic case of trying to play both sides and ending up losing both. Earlier this year, Italy was desperate to revive its struggling auto industry. One of Europe's biggest automakers, Stellantis, had announced plans to shift production from Italy to Morocco to cut costs. That decision left a huge gap in Italy's manufacturing sector, lost jobs, falling output, and political pressure to act fast. To fill that gap, Italy turned to China. In March 2024, Italian officials began negotiations with three major Chinese automakers, hoping they would build factories in Italy. They even organized tours for Chinese executives, showing off potential industrial sites and promising tax breaks. The idea was simple. If Chinese companies came in, they could create thousands of jobs and help Italy catch up in the electric vehicle race. Then, in July 2024, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni personally visited China. Her goal? Strengthen trade relations and convince China's Dongfeng Motor and other brands to invest in Italy. Local media even called it one of the biggest diplomatic wins of her administration. But just a few months later, when the EU voted on the new tariffs against Chinese EVs, Italy unexpectedly sided with Brussels and voted in favor of the tariff increase. To China, this was a betrayal, especially after Italy had just signed new cooperation agreements. As a result, Beijing suspended all planned automobile investment projects in Italy. The fallout was immediate. Those factories that could have revitalized Italy's car industry? Gone. The potential technology transfers and industrial partnerships? Frozen. Italy was left with nothing, and still struggling with Stellantis's exit. What's worse, Italy's EV market is tiny compared to other European countries. Electric cars make up only 4 to 6% of total car sales there. Italy had hoped Chinese partnerships would help accelerate its transition to clean energy. But by voting for the tariffs, it effectively cut off its own solution. Italy's double game, trying to please Brussels while courting Beijing, ended up backfiring completely. And as it turned out, this wasn't the end of China's response. It was only the beginning of a much wider economic pushback. China's reaction to Europe's tariff decision wasn't just about cars. It was about setting a precedent. Beijing wanted to make it clear, if you target Chinese industries, you'll feel it across multiple sectors. Shortly after the EU's tariff announcement, China began what analysts called a precision retaliation strategy. Instead of a loud, all-out trade war, China quietly started targeting specific European industries, the ones most vulnerable to losing access to the Chinese market. The first blow landed on European wine and dairy exporters. In June 2024, Beijing launched an anti-dumping investigation into French cognac and European dairy products. Officially, the claim was that these industries were selling below market prices. But everyone knew what it really was: payback for the EV tariffs. This move sent shockwaves across France and Germany. China is one of Europe's biggest export markets for luxury food and drinks. France alone exports over 1.5 billion euros worth of wine and spirits to China every year. Losing that market would devastate small producers across southern France. Then came the agriculture sector. China started tightening import rules on European pork, another high-value export, particularly for Spain and Denmark. Overnight, thousands of farmers faced uncertainty. Beijing didn't need to impose formal bans. Just increasing inspections and slowing customs clearances was enough to cause millions in losses. Next, China hinted at new restrictions on European aviation and pharmaceuticals, both major industries for Germany and France. Suddenly, what started as an EV tariff issue was spreading into a multi-sector trade conflict. Beijing's strategy was crystal clear. If Europe thought it could isolate one Chinese industry, China would make sure every European industry felt the pain. And behind this retaliation was a deeper message, one aimed not just at Europe, but at the rest of the world. China was proving that it could weaponize its massive market just as effectively as the West weaponizes sanctions. This marked the beginning of a new phase in global trade, one where economic interdependence became a strategic weapon. Europe wanted to protect its car makers, but in doing so, it triggered a chain reaction that reached far beyond automobiles.